Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Mountain Zoom. We're glad to have you all here this evening. Um, we've got a great topic online tonight. It's called Living with Alpha Gal Syndrome. It seems like more often I am running into somebody when I'm out and about that has alpha gal. And so tonight we have Dr. Heather Norman-Burgdolf with the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. And you can see her title there on the screen. And but Dr. Heather, thank you so much for coming on and joining us and talking to us about sharing with us about this timely topic that's of great concern, I would think. And but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. But thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. Like you said, my name's Heather. I am a professor here on campus at UK. I'm in the Department of Dietetics and Human Nutrition. I love it when A&R agents and horticulture agents reach out to me so that I can work with them because often when folks think dietetics and human nutrition, it's just FCS or family consumer sciences. So this is really a topic that kind of spans all areas of extension and has been in very high demand, I would say, in the last 18 months or so. My technical background training is more in chronic disease prevention and management, lining up with high blood pressure and heart disease and those types of things. And so I never would have thought ever when I was doing, my training to become who I am that I would work very closely with entomology and with folks in the agriculture space. But that's where alpha-gal syndrome has kind of pulled me because what Extension does best is we listen to folks in our local communities and we respond with information and programming that is most relevant to them. And so this is what we have continued to hear questions and concerns of just trying to understand what it is. So tonight, if for some, this might be pretty basic. You might have a pretty firm understanding because you yourself have lived with this for a while and you've figured these things out the hard way. For some that are watching or participating, maybe you've heard about this in your community and you're terrified, so you don't want it, and you just want a better understanding. Maybe you're a caregiver, so you're trying to prepare meals and help a loved one kind of navigate this condition, so you just want a better understanding. I'm really hoping that there's something for everyone as we go through um, this presentation tonight. All right. And I'll try to pay attention to time too. So I just have a few disclaimers before we jump into the content, and it's the fact that this is gaining attention, at the national level and at the local level, within here in the state. We're going to continue to see that the information about alpha-gal and alpha-gal syndrome changes over time. And that's a good thing because that means science is working. We're asking questions and we're figuring things out. So the information that we're sharing is evolving. I actually listened to a podcast I recorded on the topic back in 2024, just a couple days ago, to see if it was still relevant, and it wasn't because some of the information we have learned since then. So that's a good thing. So just be mindful that this information is going to evolve over time. Everything I'm sharing tonight is just for an educational purpose. I don't want this to substitute. I'm not a physician, so I'm not replacing any medical advice, maybe a previous diagnosis or, any type of treatment. This is truly for you to try to feel more equipped and prepared to be able to maybe make an informed decision for yourself or for a loved one. And then finally, as always, and some people who have alpha-gal syndrome might find this frustrating, but I really do encourage you to work with a qualified healthcare provider to kind of navigate this. There's a lot of pushback of we need to do better at educating our healthcare providers. We are making progress, but when it comes to diagnosis and treatment, we really do want to work with those healthcare providers. So I just want to throw those disclaimers out before we really dive into the content. So before we talk about alpha-gal syndrome, I think it's helpful to step back and let's just talk about what alpha-gal is itself. So alpha-gal is a sugar, and that first bullet point, oligosaccharide, is just a fancy name for a short sugar. The full name for alpha-gal is galactose alpha 1,3 galactose. So that's a mouthful. So we're not going around and saying that syndrome. So that's where we get the name alpha gal from, which is short for that sugar name. It's really interesting because uh, humans, apes, and monkeys over time have lost the ability within our bodies to make this sugar. So this sugar is not naturally found in our bodies, but it is found widely in non-primate mammals. So that's where you see it in, cows and pigs and deer. All those mammals that are non-primates do have that sugar. And so it's interesting how over time we've essentially just lost the ability for one chemical reaction to make it. And so our body just doesn't naturally have alpha gal. Now, it's a sugar, but it's not like sugar you find in a soda, where it's kind of just sugar on its own in a food or a drink, like added sugar. This sugar actually typically functions as a tag on other things. So it likes to tag on to proteins in the body, or it likes to tag on to fats in the body. So that's when you see glyco, that means sugar. So basically, a glycoprotein just means it's a protein that has a sugar tagged on. Glycolipid, a lipid is fat. It's just a lipid that has a sugar tagged on. So it's found in those non-primate mammals all throughout their bodies, in fluids and different tissues and organs. And so that's important when we kind of think about exposures and triggers later on when it comes to our food. In the picture on the slide here, the two yellow circles kind of represents the alpha gal molecule, and this just kind of shows you that it likes to tag on to other things. So it's largely found not by itself when it's presenting in a non-primate mammal. So that's alpha-gal itself, the sugar. Now, the syndrome, for many years, has been casually mentioned or referenced as the red meat allergy. And I'm really glad we're getting away from that because that couldn't be farther from the truth. It simplifies the condition. People who have this would be like, I wish it was the red meat allergy, and that was all that I had to worry about. But so we're kind of moving away from that, and you will more widely see alpha-gal syndrome or AGS as people start to gain a better understanding. So this is a syndrome that is an allergic reaction to that alpha-gal sugar. So it's really fascinating because the vast majority of food allergies or allergies that we have are to a protein. So you kind of think of shellfish or nuts, peanut, that kind of thing. They're all typically protein foods or foods high in protein. But this case, it's against a sugar. It's not an infection, which can be confusing because we do know ticks are associated. We'll get there. It's delayed with ingestion. So whereas if someone has a shellfish allergy, they eat shrimp, and then within a minute, right, you might see their lips swell or their tongue starts to swell. So it's really an immediate response. It's also unique as an allergy because there's a delay with symptoms presenting. But what we do know is that, say you receive alpha-gal through an IV, through either, a medication or exposure that way, it is instantaneous. So once it gets into the bloodstream, that's where we start to see that immune response, and boom, you can go from there. So yeah, it's just a unique scenario where it's a sugar causing that immune response. And then this is where why I work closely with entomology is because what we know is that it's linked to tick bites, and that tends to be the trigger for the production of the IgE antibodies against alpha-gal. Now, how are ticks and AGS linked? So this is where I think we're starting to see the most evolution in thought and idea about how these two things are linked. Now, there is substantial evidence that links the two, that tick bites are the current way that we know humans are exposed to the alpha-gal sugar molecule. So again, galactose alpha 1,3 galactose. At first, it was thought that and I'm not an entomologist, that's my disclaimer. This is the acquired knowledge I've gained from other smart bug people. You know, that tick bites the host, which is a non-primate mammal. So, they bite a deer out in the field. Okay. So they pick up that alpha-gal sugar in their mouth parts from that host. And then they say they bite a human, introducing that alpha-gal sugar, which we don't typically have in our body. And your body sees it as foreign. And so then it amounts that immune response, which results in the allergic reaction. So it was thought that the tick was acquiring it from the host and then introducing it to the human. But now there's some really interesting science out there that's kind of pushing back at that. And so that I think this is where we're still trying to figure out how ticks are acquiring alpha-gal. Some studies say that the tick itself can produce the alpha-gal, so it doesn't even need to have a host. This is because we can see the larval stage of the tick can also introduce alpha-gal prior to being exposed to a host. So pay attention, especially if you're kind of in this space, because I do think we'll see a lot more good science coming out. So that's where, once introduced, the human body may think that that alpha-gal molecule is an invader. That's when it mounts that immune response, creating those IgE antibodies, which kind of serve as that warning sign to the body that, hey, we need to react. So once you have that exposure to alpha-gal, typically through food, we know it can be other things, it's going to trigger that allergic response because the body's perceiving that molecule as a threat. Now, I have this specific tick on the slide. When I first started talking about alpha-gal, I always had the wrong tick. I didn't realize I just put a tick, you search for an image, you put tick. I didn't realize I was putting the wrong one. But that is the actual Lone Star tick. The reason it has that name, this is the female here. It has that large white circle on its dot. That's where it gets its name, Lone Star tick. In Kentucky, this is the most common tick. It hasn't always been, but it is now. I'm going to keep this slide brief because, again, I'm not a tick expert, but just to make sure we have enough information to move forward. Their life cycle is pretty much throughout the year. You've got the larvae, which are going to be second half of the year, and then the adults and nymphs are going to be kind of as the spring starts to thaw and the months start to get warmer. Um, if you lay over here a map of where Lone Star ticks are and then the prevalence of alpha-gal syndrome, you can kind of see they map nicely, unfortunately. And it is the most prominent tick here in Kentucky. This is probably the tick where we have the most evidence that Lone Star ticks and alpha-gal are linked. There are studies coming out showing that other ticks across the United States can carry alpha-gal syndrome up in the Northeast. And as this condition kind of moves out west, we might see some other species. Unfortunately, Kentucky is in the top 10 states with the highest number of cases. Now, this data that I'm referencing here is a couple years old, 2023, 2024. I'm hoping that we have some new data that comes out soon. And then when we look at specific counties across the country, some Kentucky counties rise to the very, very top. So I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Muhlenberg County. It's out west. When we look at per capita, they have the second highest number of cases in the nation per million people, which is slightly concerning. What we do know is that the trends in prevalence match deer migration patterns or the prevalence of deer. So that is one of the mechanisms that folks are suggesting that alpha-gal syndrome is spreading is because, the deer migration is spreading. Again, I'm not an expert in this. We can talk to some other um, natural resource folks, but there is a connection there. So how prevalent? We're talking about it because so many people are impacted by it, and it has exploded within the last couple decades. So virtually unheard of as recent as 2009. The most recent data we have right now from 2023 has almost 500,000 cases. I'm going to anticipate that once those numbers come back out and are updated, that number is going to be much, much, much higher. One, our awareness is much, much higher. Provider awareness is increasing. And I think a lot of people have lived a long time undiagnosed. And so if that's coming to light, I believe that number is going to be much higher. There was one study that came out that was saying about 15,000 new cases were being reported each year. So we could even do the math since 2023. But I do think that that number is probably much higher. It is everywhere. It's not just in the US. This is not something that only the United States is experiencing right now. It's on all continents except Antarctica. And I think across the world, there are 8 different tick species that have been linked to alpha-gal syndrome as well. So this is the some of the most common questions we get off the bat. If someone doesn't have alpha-gal syndrome and they're like, I can't get this. I can't imagine if I had this. Like, how do I reduce risk? Who is at risk? Do we know? And there's a few knowns and there's a few unknowns here. And I do think this will again be a part of that evolution of science over time. Those who spend a considerable amount of time outside are at great risk. That could be from their occupation. There are studies out there that show those who are in forestry, landscaping, even golf course managers, those folks who are outside because of their job are twice as likely to have alpha-gal syndrome as someone who doesn't. We also know recreationally it could put you at risk. So those who are avid hikers or intense gardeners, being outside alone, no matter if it's for fun or work, can put you at risk. We also know if you live in a state that has a high prevalence of Lone Star ticks, that in and of itself, adults tend to, in the past few years, are more likely to be diagnosed, but we're seeing more and more children. So I think that might be something that changes over time. And then those with the B antigen in their blood type. So this seems weird. But actually, those with the B antigen in their blood, so if you have AB blood type, B blood type, that actually could be protective to some degree. And it has to do with the structure of that B antigen in your blood is actually similar in shape to the alpha-gal sugar. So your body, if it is introduced to alpha-gal, might not mount as strong of an immune response, maybe say if you had an O blood type or an A blood type. So it's not that you can't get alpha-gal, but those who have a B blood type antigen actually don't tend to have as severe cases or reactions. So this is something to kind of pay attention to. Another one I don't have listed on the screen is that there seems to be a link between potentially heart disease, like atherosclerosis, and alpha-gal risk. And I think one of the connecting points is kind of this high level of inflammation that your body might already have, where it's kind of like heightened, prepared for a response. And so once it sees that invader of alpha-gal, it might be more inclined to mount a response. So again, this is where I think we're going to see some new studies and literature come out that are going to give us a better picture of who's potentially at increased risk. We don't really know for sure if those who have, childhood allergies or anything like that are more likely later in life to develop alpha-gal syndrome. It seems like a lot of people who get this condition have never had to manage any type of allergy or food allergy before. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to adjust and adapt because you've never really had to think about your food choices before. And then it's just shock of trying to figure it out. And yeah, what do we want to know? We want to know if there's other common predictors, age, male, female, those types of things. There's still room to grow and learn here. I apologize. There's a lot of words on the screen. Feel free to kind of read that or digest that. I'll try to walk through it and hit the high points here, being mindful of time. So, timing of alpha-gal allergic reactions. So, what's so interesting is that not every tick bite results in alpha-gal syndrome. So, there's timing there. You could be bitten by a Lone Star tick and nothing ever happens. The You could be bitten by a Lone Star tick in June and then maybe not even know it. And then say September, you start to present symptoms. So it could be that it is months later before you present. So you can see how difficult it could be to diagnose something like this. It could be that you need multiple tick bites over the course of months or years, which kind of primes your body over time to then someday have a response. So the timing is kind of all over the board, whether you're thinking about the initial bite or even the reactions of when they're going to occur. And then if you do have alpha gal syndrome, typically it's 8 to 8 hours later after the exposure that you have your reaction, which seems strange. I kind of touched on that a little bit when I was referencing like shellfish tends to be immediate, and in this case, it could be several hours later. So for some folks, you go to bed or you have dinner, you eat a steak, it was great. You go to bed, you wake up at 2 a.m. with horrible GI, upset stomach, diarrhea, maybe you're vomiting. You might think of foodborne illness. You might have been, well, did I eat something that was bad, right? You're not necessarily putting two and two together. So that timing can make things difficult. The other crazy thing is that each reaction in the same person, depending kind of on what the trigger exposure was could be a different symptom. So maybe you're exposed to fumes. So then maybe it's itchy face and itchy throat and it's hard to breathe. If you eat it though, maybe you have that GI pain or joint pain or fatigue. So every exposure could be different. So also a complicating factor when thinking about diagnosis. I've referenced some of the common symptoms here, which are listed on the right side of the slide. So, as a food allergy, we often think of like skin irritation, so your hives and rash. And the majority of people do experience that. For those who have an initial onset, it tends to be like itchy hands and feet are one of the first things you experience. You do have that swelling of the lips, throat, tongues, your eyes getting swollen, abdominal cramping. So about 75% of folks can experience that. And then there are other symptoms that are not typical for food allergies. So drops in blood pressure. There's a cardiac effect. So your blood pressure may drop. You might feel very faint. You might pass out, joint pain, or just fatigue, malaise, some of those types of things. And so again, symptoms can be different with each exposure and from person to person. Your best friend, you might have alpha gal, and your best friend might have alpha gal. You could have two very different lived experiences. The thing I haven't mentioned so far is shortness of breath and difficulty breathing. And so that makes us kind of think of that anaphylactic shock where you're unable to breathe. That's where people tend to need the epinephrine auto pen injector, the EpiPen. There's studies that show that alpha-gal syndrome is the most common cause of anaphylaxis in adults at this point, the 10th most common food allergy that is out there. And anaphylaxis is very, very common. So that's just something to keep in mind. Severity, I've already hinted at it. Again, reactions are different from person to person, could be mild to severe. You can kind of manage or treat based on the severity. So, mild symptom might just need some antihistamines. Severe, again, we've got to be mindful of an emergency response medication. Severity doesn't tend to be linked to other existing allergies, current allergies, or even if folks are, allergic to bee stings or anything like that. And then, like I mentioned earlier, less likely to present those severe symptoms if you have a B antigen in your blood type. I don't know if everybody knows their blood type. I do not have B blood type, so it scares me to think about how much time we spend outside. Diagnosis. So you probably could already pick up on some of the things I've shared so far that diagnosis can be challenging. Often it's due to the inconsistencies, the delays in the reactions, not always having the same symptoms every time, or, it's easy with shellfish or shrimp because it's kind of like one thing, right? So you eat shrimp every time you have that reaction. Well, with alpha gal, you could eat a steak, feel terrible, and you cut it, you don't eat any more steak, but then say you eat a bowl of cereal with milk and then you have a reaction. So you're like, what is the connecting point? Because there's so many different foods that could potentially be a trigger. So that can also be difficult. Really the standard for diagnosis is a physical exam. So kind of look at some of your metrics, your biometrics, a blood test. So it's going to be a blood draw, and then taking a patient history. So hopefully, if your provider is asking you questions of What do you do for a living? How much time do you spend outside? Do you recall any tick bites that you've had? If your provider's not asking you these questions, this is the type of information you should share with your provider, especially if you are suspicious of alpha-gal syndrome yourself. So let them know about some of those things that are tied to risk factors. So you want them to actually to do a blood test looking specifically for the IgE antibody against alpha-gal. Now, there are a few other blood tests out there that have similar names. And there's been some anecdotal stories of folks who, you go in for your blood test and then the provider actually ordered the wrong blood test, so you don't necessarily get your results. So, alpha galactosidase and alpha galactosidase A deficiency are different things. You just want to look at the IgE antibodies for alpha gal. So, you can even clarify that and make sure when you go to have your blood drawn at the lab that you confirm with the phlebotomist or the tech or whoever it is and just be like, I want to confirm that this is what we're testing before that takes place, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So that those are the key pieces a provider will use in order to essentially diagnose whoever it is, you or your loved one with alpha-gal syndrome. This might look a little complicated, but I bring this up for a couple reasons. And one of the main reasons is the triangle wedge on the bottom of the slide that see here. So I want to be mindful of something called cofactors. These are factors that are a part of life that can influence what your reaction looks like. So they increase the risk or they can increase the severity of a reaction that you have. And the most common cofactors are alcohol, like alcoholic beverages, exercise, and over-the-counter NSAIDs, pain reliever medications. The reason I bring this up is because some people's lived experiences with alpha-gal syndrome is that they only have a reaction if you pair a trigger food or exposure with one of these things. So maybe they can regularly eat dairy, but say they eat dairy and then they go out for a run, that could cause that reaction to occur. So kind of the way this slide works is that as you go up the slide, those are things that tend to cause a more severe, higher risk for severe reaction. And then as you go to my right, and you present those cofactors, it's going to also kind of increase the severity. So if you pair those things together, you need to be really mindful. So if you have organ meat from pig or cow, and then say you have an alcoholic beverage, you could be putting yourself at greater risk for a severe reaction. So I'm mindful of time. Okay, 7:30. So that is alpha-gal. I've spent half our time almost just kind of talking about what it is, and all the different complicating factors that come into play. And because it is so new that we're trying to figure this out, we don't have a treatment. There is no known cure, unfortunately. And so it truly does require lifestyle management. And I present it in this way because people, when they were calling it the red meat allergy, they're saying, "Hey, you just cut red meat out of out of your diet and you're good." It is way more than just dietary management. There are many, many, many moving pieces to this for people to live with high quality of life. It's possible. It's totally possible. There's great success stories out there of folks who have figured out alpha-gal syndrome and really enjoy food and the things that make life great. But it takes work and there's a big learning curve. So I kind of already mentioned that you want to try to work with a health professional, but there's a lot that you kind of have to do on your own or with your support network or with loved ones. And that is essentially removing triggers from your life, whether that is food, medication, personal care items. We'll talk about each of those. And we want to do everything we can to prevent any subsequent exposure, especially through tick bites. So I would almost say preventing future tick bites is just as important or more important than other things, other factors that we could do. Again, it's complex to diagnose and to manage because you've got the delayed reaction, you have inconsistent symptoms, your severity may vary drastically. If you're trying to figure this out, the one thing that, folks tend to say that makes the most sense is that the inconsistencies with alpha-gal syndrome is actually the most consistent thing about it. And so that could be a clue for you if you're trying to figure things out, or maybe you're experiencing some weird things to think about alpha-gal syndrome. And so these are some of the management pieces that we can put into place to kind of help and see if it improves your health. So I have four squares here at the bottom: heightened awareness of medications and medical treatments. We're going to consider our personal care items. We're going to make some dietary changes. And then as we go through all of that, that is really focused on physical health. We're also going to consider mental health. I'm not a mental health professional. I have friends who are, but I will say I'm not going to leave this talk without mentioning how important it is to protect your mental health, because there is a true burden and a difficulty to managing a chronic condition, especially if there's a lot of unknowns wrapped around it. So I want to spend the rest of our time kind of walking through these four different buckets. All right, so medications and medical treatment. So this is where you are going to have to ask lots of questions. You're going to have to be inquisitive and not be scared to. You got to be your own advocate, especially if you feel frustrated because people don't understand or they've never heard of something, to just ask questions. So here we need to be mindful of everything that you could put in your body that has some purpose to try to heal or manage some type of health condition or concern. So it could be an over-the-counter medication that you go pick up at the supermarket. It could be a prescription medication that your provider gives to you. It could be a dietary supplement. You don't necessarily think of that as being a medication, but that is could be in a pill form, it could be a powder form, a gel, whatever it is. And then other medical treatments. So say you go into the clinic and you need stitches. Well, that's going to require, an antiseptic, and it's going to require maybe some sutures and some bandages with adhesive. And so all those things we have to be mindful of. There are some known prescription medications that have alpha-gal in them. The one of the reasons why we know about alpha-gal syndrome is actually because of the cancer drug cetuximab. So it is a monoclonal antibody treatment that is used for different types of cancer. And they actually saw in clinical trials that people were having severe allergic reactions to that drug. And it has to do with the fact its relation to alpha-gal. Heparin, antivenoms, even thinking about how we get a lot of our biosynthetic heart valves from cows and pigs, that could also be an exposure or a trigger. So if you're having to talk to providers about those types of things, you've got to mention alpha-gal syndrome. I strongly encourage you, if you don't already, to have alpha-gal listed in your medical chart as a drug allergy. So if you are able and have access to a healthcare provider and you go in and they're doing the intake of do you have any allergies, you will say alpha-gal. I have alpha-gal syndrome. Anytime someone recommends a treatment, you can ask, do you know if that is safe for someone living with alpha-gal? And so I also encourage some folks who are really maybe trying to figure out triggers and exposures. It might be worth wearing a medical information bracelet. So this, people who have type 1 diabetes might wear one, right, to notify people in an emergency situation that they have type 1 diabetes so they know immediately how to treat them. So maybe that's what you could have. You could have a bracelet that has alpha-gal syndrome, or it says you have an EpiPen in your bag or something like that. Also, your phone is a great place to store health information for an emergency. So you could list alpha-gal here. I do want to mention a website now. Some may be familiar with it. It's called pillclarity.com. I, I am just recommending this as a website you can go to that will you can put in any type of treatment or medication or supplement, and it will let you know if there are any known allergens. And that is a website run by pharmacists. And so that could be a resource for folks who are trying to figure out if something is safe. Personal care items. So this is where I think it gets tricky and people get really frustrated. So this could be everything from chapstick to shampoo, if you wear makeup or skincare, even toilet papers might have, you know, a fragrance or aloe or something added to it. And these can be problematic if any of the ingredients are mammalian derived, because that could be a source of exposure to the alpha-gal sugar. So we've seen quite a few times of folks who have said, I have made so many dietary changes. There is no way that I have triggers in my diet, but I'm still having these reactions. And so then we say, well, have you looked at the label on the lotion you put on every day? Or, thinking about lanolin or gelatin or collagen, glycerin, some of these common ingredients that are found both in food and in personal care items could be derived from mammals. And so it'll have that on the label as an ingredient, and you don't know based on the label if it's sourced from a plant or from animals. And so that can be challenging. So this is just something to consider or think about because there are a lot of ingredients. We tend to think we make a dietary change, we remove a food, but we have to think about ingredients for personal care as well as foods. Now, this is a busy slide. It is small font, but I have just thrown on here several items that are either medication, personal care, or ingredients that you could find in both the personal care or in foods that could be a potential source. Now, some of these do have alpha-gal safe versions that are out there, so they could be derived from plants, and that would not necessarily be a concern. But these are things to be mindful of. We have an extension publication called Food Allergens Alpha Gal. I think Jeremy might drop that into the chat and we can share that widely. But it kind of walks you through some of the information we've talked through tonight, but it has these lists in that publication. So it could be an easy reference or resource tool for you to print off and kind of keep handy so that you can maybe look at a label for something and say, oh, this actually has castoreum in it. So maybe that's a concern. So I just want to put this out there that this is available to you for you to have as a resource. Now let's talk about dietary changes in our last few minutes. Um, the hardest part is that foods and ingredients that could have been safe for someone for decades now have to be removed. And there's grief that comes with that. I have foods that I love, and if I was told I couldn't have them again for the foreseeable future, I would be upset, right? There's a processing that's going to take place. Food is so much more than just nutrients. Food is part of celebrations and connecting with people. And so there could be grief that takes place, and that is totally normal and is a healthy thing. And unfortunately, that best form of management is removing the allergen from the diet and seeing if we have a positive response. So these tend to be the foods that are most problematic. So I'll give you a second to kind of look at the list. At the top, that's where we got that name, the red meat allergy, right? Because it was folks who were eating beef and pork and lamb. Um, what we actually know now is that alpha-gal levels in organ meats, so maybe you're eating liver, kidney, tripe, heart, they are actually higher in alpha-gal. We also know foods on this list that are higher in fat, so maybe a fattier steak have higher amounts of alpha-gal. And that's going back to where we kind of talked about the structure of how alpha-gal likes to attach to other things. So it likes to attach to fats. And so you might find lots of alpha-gal in the fatty parts of meat. Wild game. This is incredibly important when we think about Kentucky. Not only is it for sport here, but this is a major source of food procurement for a lot of people. I think about all the cook wild Kentucky recipes that are out there for venison and squirrel, rabbit, right? So we have to be mindful that those are all sources as well. Dairy foods. Initial studies were saying that people with alpha-gal, 30 to 50% could tolerate dairy. I think that's probably changed. It's kind of rare to find someone who has alpha-gal that can tolerate dairy from mammals regularly. With that said, there are some folks out there that can handle no fat or skim milk, but they can't have whole milk. And again, that goes back to the fat amount, right? Skim milk has no fat All that fat's been skimmed off and removed, whereas you have whole fat or heavy cream or half and half. Those types of things are problematic because the fat content's higher. Now, those are kind of the foods that come from the animal, but what are the foods that we make from those things? Broths and bouillon, stocks, gravy, the lard that we maybe use to make your biscuits, right? So those are all potential sources. And then a couple that aren't from mammals that throws people off. These are the only two things that we know of so far that are problematic and aren't derived from mammals are flounder eggs, so roe, and then a specific type of red algae that can be problematic. So even some folks will be like, I have alpha gal, so I've just gone vegan, so I don't have to worry about it. There are a couple things we need to be mindful of that would be a part of maybe a vegetarian or vegan diet that could still be a potential exposure. Now, with you're like all the gloom and doom of what can I eat, there are a lot of things. There really are. Not to say that it's easy, but there are options out there, especially if this is a substantial shift in what you prefer in your dietary pattern. The number one question I used to get is I have alpha gal and I'm worried about getting enough protein. Um, so I want to right off the bat just say that alpha gal safe foods does not mean low protein or limited varieties in protein. So first, right there is poultry. So people will be like, I'm so tired of grilled chicken. Okay, well, we've got turkey, duck. I'm throwing out emu and ostrich and quail. I just saw that an emu farm in Danville, Kentucky is getting some national attention because they're shipping out emu. If you've never had emu, I actually haven't. I'd like to try it. It cooks very similar to beef. So a roast, think of a roast that you could make. So lots of people are experimenting with different types of poultry. Seafood is still on the table. So fish and shellfish, crab, well, all the things you can get from the sea. Eggs are an excellent source of protein and nutrients. You have all your plant-based proteins, so beans, peas, lentils, nuts and seeds, whole grains have protein. So it's going to give you a little bit more nutritional bang for your buck. You'll get some more vitamins and minerals and a little bit more protein and fiber. And then all fruits and vegetables are still available. So really you can create a balanced, nutritious, high protein diet using these foods. Now, I mentioned, people go vegan or vegetarian, and you don't have to do that. You really don't. But I will say that some people, when they're making this shift in their diet, find inspiration when they look at plant-based cookbooks or dairy-free and vegan recipes. Not that they have to prepare those all the time, but those recipes might eliminate some triggers or ingredients for you that it might be a little easier to follow. Those recipes or cookbooks could teach you how to prepare ingredients maybe you've never prepared for before. So if you can't have cheese and you're really craving some mac and cheese, you could potentially find a vegan mac and cheese recipe that will teach you how to use nutritional yeast that kind of gives you that savory texture and taste of cheese when you can't have it. So it's not like you have to lock into those lifestyles for eating or patterns, but they could be informative if you're trying to learn and try new things. And then a lot of times, many recipes could be adapted. So you have your favorite family recipes. It could be that you just need to tweak one or two things, and that recipe is still safe and an option for you to have. We just went through all of our plated up Kentucky Proud recipes. So it's a database of 170 recipes on the UK Extension website. And we were like, let's see which ones are Alpha Gal safe, right? So that if people are asking for recipes, we could point them there. And we were pleasantly surprised at how many were or could be modified with just changing one ingredient. Maybe it was changing milk to almond milk, and it could potentially be safe. So there can be room to experiment and learn and try new things, still have nutritious foods and meet your protein needs. I'm throwing this up here because I want to give a clear example of how you can still meet your protein needs. So here I've done a little math. So we're considering a 200-pound man who needs, based on kind of calculations, 73 grams of protein each day. So, is it possible if this man has alpha-gal syndrome to meet his protein needs? So, I have thrown some things on this menu. So, he has breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. I tried to think about access of what might be available, and maybe your community only has a Dollar General. Maybe you do have access to a Kroger or a larger grocery store, things that are shelf stable. So maybe you could pull from your pantry or the freezer to kind of to make this menu. And so after putting some pretty common foods on here, take a look, we've got turkey sausage for breakfast. We want to be mindful that the casing doesn't come from pork, but that would be on the label. We've got some scrambled eggs, we threw in some vegetables, a couple slices of toast. For lunch, we're having tuna salad. That's 22 grams of protein right there. You're having some chicken breasts with vegetables, brown rice. So, some common foods, 106.5 grams of protein. So, well above what his recommendation was for the day. He's able to meet through some of these more common foods, just to give you an example that it is possible. I know that I'm saying it and it sounds easy, and I understand in real life it can be much more difficult. I just want to give folks a little hope that it is possible for you to be able to meet your needs and eat a variety of different foods throughout the day. In our last 10-ish minutes, we've got some important final kind of takeaways, very practical things to think about as you move forward with that lifestyle management. Because we've talked about medications, we've talked about personal care, we've talked about dietary changes, and then here are some things to kind of help put that into practice. So, in order to manage alpha-gal, you're going to have to develop some very strong label and ingredients list reading skills. So there are lots of things that could be listed in ingredients that we don't know the source. We don't know if it's from a plant or an animal. So, and natural flavors tends to kind of be the last thing listed in an ingredients list. So we're talking about, you've got your nutrition facts label or your panel that tells you how many servings and those types of things. And under that usually is the ingredients list. And it's listed in order of the most ingredient to the least. And so some of these can be confusing. So, common additives, natural flavors, we might not know if that's from a mammal or a plant source. It might actually require that you call the food manufacturer and ask them, or email them and ask them. So, you really do have to become an investigator or a detective. Some labels that we love to just stick words on the front of packaging. Also, many of those can be very confusing because non-dairy may still actually include dairy. Doesn't make sense, I know. Instead, dairy-free means that that item is free of dairy. So those two things are not the same. So dairy-free is what you're going to want to look for. Often people think that if the label has vegan or cruelty-free on it, that it is going to be alpha-gal safe, right? Because it's vegan. There's no animals connected to this at all. But that does not mean that mammals were not used for an ingredient in the item. It might mean that cruelty-free might mean that it wasn't tested on an animal, not necessarily that a mammalian ingredient or byproduct wasn't used in it. Vegan is also not regulated. Um, Now, if it's is certified vegan, that means it's gone through a third party review, and there is a neutral organization that has reviewed that item, and they have put a stamp on it saying that it actually is vegan, and you can trust that label. But if it just has vegan on it, it could just be a marketing tactic to try to get folks to purchase that item. So you want to kind of look for the certified vegan label on it to know that it's truly vegan. The other thing that's super frustrating for folks is you might say, hey, I can go to the grocery store. I know exactly which brands that are alpha-gal safe. I know specifically what ingredients to be mindful of and what they're sourced from. So I'm good. I know that these crackers are safe and this cereal is safe. What's frustrating is that food manufacturers can change ingredients and those packaged products without notice. So I do think it's helpful, even if you feel like you have a really good grasp on what packaged foods you can have, to regularly check the ingredients list to see if it changes, because it could without being notified. And then, paying attention to if the sourcing of any of those ingredients have changed over time. I am all for thinking about food access. So, what do I have available in a rural community? What nutritious foods can I get at the dollar store? Um, those types of things. I understand processed foods can be a part of a balanced diet because that might be all that's available to someone. But what we tend to see with alpha-gal syndrome is that foods that are closest to their natural form are less likely to contain hidden ingredients or byproducts. So, what I mean is trying to take that food ingredient closest to the source of where it came from. So, maybe you're purchasing carrots in the produce section compared to a can of carrots. So, with the can of carrots, you might need to actually look at the label. I'm all for canned carrots, but it might just be an extra step that you need to be mindful of when you're trying to choose foods that are alpha-gal safe. That's all that I'm saying. So, just another thing to kind of keep in mind. It's another list of foods, products, ingredients that may contain alpha-gal. This is also included in that extension publication that I highlighted a few slides back. This list, some of these are very common sense. So beef broth, you're like, yes, I'm not going to have beef broth if I have alpha-gal. But some of them could be surprising. So, for example, marshmallows. Well, you're like, that doesn't come from a cow, doesn't come from deer. So why is that? Well, it's gelatin, right? So where do we get gelatin? It's a byproduct primarily for mammals that's used to make marshmallows. So you've got to kind of think about what those ingredients are. Now, could there be marshmallows that are safe? Absolutely. But these are just kind of things to keep in mind as you're pulling together foods and menus and making choices when you're grocery shopping. Last few slides. I do want to mention dietary supplements. It's a question that I get often. I've been diagnosed with alpha-gal syndrome. Should I be taking a dietary supplement? There's no studies out there that say those who have alpha-gal are more likely to be deficient in a specific vitamin or mineral. This is a great conversation starter with your healthcare team. I strongly recommend to you to ask for a registered dietitian, nutritionist. This is the only qualified person to work with you specifically about managing your diet. They would be a great source. A pharmacist might also be a good option. I know a lot of rural communities are more likely to have a pharmacist compared to some other providers. It could potentially fill some nutrient gaps. It's a hard pivot. You've had to cut out all these foods and you're really concerned you're not meeting your nutrient needs. It could be what the name says. It could supplement your diet. They're not meant to replace. These are supplements. See, could they supplement? The things to be most mindful of are some of the nutrients that primarily come from mammal foods. And these are the same things we say to people who are vegan and vegetarian. We want to be mindful of vitamin B12, which is only found in animal foods, vitamin D, iron, calcium, zinc. So those are some of the big ones. Now, you can't just run out and grab any supplement here because we still need to be mindful of all the things we said earlier when it came to medical treatment, medications, personal care items, because they're coming in gel caps. And if it's made of gelatin derived from a mammal, that supplement in and of itself could cause a reaction or a trigger. So here I'll plug that website again, pillclarity.org, that you could go to and do a little investigating to see if the product you would like to purchase is alpha-gal safe. Here's some other quick hitting food considerations to be mindful of that are pretty practical. Food safety. So, yes, fruits and vegetables, we can have those all day. Just like we tell every person, no matter if they have alpha-gal or not, we want you to rinse your fruits and vegetables before you eat them. You don't need any fancy produce soap. You just need to run them under some cool running water, a little friction, rub the surface of the apple or whatever it is to remove any excess coatings that could have been added to preserve freshness if that produce had to travel a long distance to get to where you are. That there have been some reportings that some of those coatings have a mammalian byproduct. But yes, eat your fruits and vegetables. Cooking does not destroy the sugar. So we want to be mindful of cross-contamination during cooking, whether that is preparing. Maybe you have your alpha-gal safe foods that you're preparing in your cast iron, but the last thing prepared in the cast iron was a beef steak. So, maybe there could be some contamination or crossover there. We also want to be mindful of, touching food packaging. Maybe you have alpha-gal and you're the primary person in your home that does the grocery shopping. And other folks in the family, they still eat bacon or whatever it is. So you grab the bacon out of the grocery bag. Maybe touching that packaging could be a trigger. We also know fumes could be problematic for some people. So if you're in the kitchen and you've got stuff soups boiling on the stove, or you've got slow cooker and you take the lid off and the fumes hit you in the face, that could be a potential exposure. And then the last thing I'll put here are food logs. If you're really having difficulty figuring out or managing symptoms of saying, I'm so frustrated, I've eliminated all these things, it might be helpful to write things down, what you had, when you had them. I know some people will even take pictures with their phone of their food label and they keep them in albums on their phone, so that they can kind of keep track of food packaging and ingredients lists and those types of things to kind of keep an eye on. It's just different ways to kind of record and help you maybe put puzzle pieces together if you're trying to figure out triggers, and exposures over time. I want to plug mental health in my last couple minutes because managing this condition can be incredibly isolating. There can be a sense of hopelessness. People experience grief. Maybe it's anticipatory grief. So well, I can't have those foods that I love at Thanksgiving that I've had for every Thanksgiving since I was born, right? That all matters. I just want to say there's different levels of mental health support. So you could have peer support. I got a call just yesterday from an extension agent out in Paducah, wanting to talk about forming a support group for Alpha Gal. So maybe there's a physical group, maybe it's online. There's plenty of Facebook pages and those types of things that could be a place where you could get product suggestions and recipe ideas. Now, I do want to, have a word of caution that there can be a lot of hysteria. And in those online spaces, you tend to hear the worst and the best. And so you just get caught up in that and you forget about kind of all the folks that are living with it in the middle. So just making sure that you're checking in and being like, is this evidence-based what I'm hearing? Is this something everyone's experiencing? And just stay critical, right? And ask questions. Ask for professional support. Maybe you talk to your provider about this is just too much for me to bear. I don't have anyone that else that understands or experiences, and it's so frustrating. And somebody that maybe there's a professional mental health support person, such as a counselor, a psychologist, telemedicine, telehealth, that could be a resource to you. And then just find ways to take care of yourself, things that you enjoy. It might feel like you're spending all your time thinking about alpha gal. So try to put yourself in a space, do something where you're not necessarily just thinking about alpha gal. Whether sleep is on here. It could be journaling. It could be picking up a new hobby, learning an instrument, something that kind of in a positive way is feeding your brain. And it's not just negative that you're kind of thinking about over and over all the time. So, as a recap, it is 8 o'clock. I know I'm at time. These are kind of the big buckets that I would put some of the things we've talked about into as my take home message. What is the immediate adjustments that we need to make if we're managing this? So, that's going to be immediately try to remove those common trigger foods, those red meat sources, the common byproducts. Maybe that's where you start your food log to kind of get a handle on things. And you head into the bathroom and you look at your medicine cabinet, and you're in a closet to kind of see what is it that I'm still exposing myself to. I want to ensure that you are prepared medically and that you stay safe. So maybe it's you start to explore if there's any allergists in the area. Maybe you learn about anaphylaxis because you might not experience anaphylaxis, but being prepared that maybe that next accidental exposure could be at that level. So knowing what that start feels like or starts to look like, just informing yourself. And maybe you need to take the step of a medical bracelet, so that you truly stay safe in an emergency situation. Try to be adventurous, look for alternatives, try new things. This is where I have tried emu or maybe other meat alternatives that are out there. Finding ways to stay informed, looking for spaces where you can continue to learn evidence-based information about alpha-gal syndrome. I think Cooperative Extension is a great place for that, but there's some really great websites. The alpha-gal information website is a great space to go to that's constantly updated. And then thinking about long-term management and support, I want to emphasize the bolded one at the bottom of the tick bite prevention strategies. We could spend an entire hour, well, not me, but experts with ticks, talking about tick bite prevention strategies to try to help either reduce that exposure for people who already have alpha-gal or prevent people who don't from getting it in the first place. So here is my email. I am an open book. I'm pretty sure Jeremy has shared some, there might be some stuff in the chat. That's all I have. I hope there was a little bit of information or knowledge in there that you can take away with that helped you or that you can share with a loved one and makes things easier for you. I appreciate you guys being here. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Heather, thank you so much. Excellent information, excellent timely information. A lot of great stuff there. Anybody have any questions, comments? Shad had actually texted me and mentioned to see if Sheila might even have a comment.
I see she made a comment about MCAS, MCAS. So this is something that you'll commonly see with folks who have alpha-gal syndrome is that they also present mast cell activation syndrome. It's a different syndrome, but they kind of go hand in hand and having it. This is where it benefits having a low histamine diet. I didn't really talk about that today, but there are lists out there that can highlight what foods are high and low in histamines, and that can be beneficial for people to try to reduce uh, reactions as well. Anything else? I'll put my email in the chat. You're more than welcome to send me an email. Um, and if a question comes to you later on, I'll do my best to get you a response.
Okay. Let's see. I think there was some more. Let me see if there was another. Uh, oh, Shad, at some point in time, he mentioned, is this because these are immune suppressors? And I'm not sure where that came in
Oh,
on.
and probably referencing cofactors. So yes, thinking about alcohol, exercise,
Yes. Yes.
NSAIDs. Yes, there's probably something at play there. Good question.
Um,
And thank you for sharing the publication too. I appreciate that.
you're welcome. Thank you for sharing your email, your insight on AGS, and hopefully that I know this will help a lot of people out there
Mhm.
that are I guess you could say in this fight
Yeah,
with AGS, and uh, we've got several that are on here this evening, and we're going to get it to YouTube. Shad said he's going to give it to the government channel to get to
perfect.
run it on there. So we're going to get the information out there.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate the invitation.
Heather, thank you so much. And to everybody that joined us this evening, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you next week on another Mountain soon. But everybody have a great evening. Stay warm. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank
Bye.